The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. In 2021, the state of Georgia passed an election reform law in response to allegation of voting irregularities in the 2020 elections. Whether there was truly significant fraud and whether the new law is an improvement on the old law is a topic for others to debate. In response to the passage of this law by the state, Major League Baseball moved the 2021 All-Star Game, which had been scheduled to be held in Atlanta, to Colorado. And the CEO of Coca-Cola, James Quincy, stated, "This legislation is unacceptable. It's a step backwards and it does not promote principles we have stood for in Georgia." This is just one example of a trend of corporations acting to promote certain social and environmental goals. Is this what corporations should be doing? Who should be deciding what corporations do? Should government authorities like the Securities and Exchange Commission push corporations to do more to advance environmental and social goals? These questions have been analyzed and debated by professors of economics, business, and law for decades. Joining me on the show today is Mr. Mike DeBow. He was the Stephen Everett Wells Professor of Municipal Law at the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. Professor DeBow has bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of Alabama, and he earned his law degree from Yale Law School. Before teaching at Samford, Professor DeBow clerked for then federal judge Ken Starr and was an advisor to the Federal Trade Commission. He's also served as an assistant to the Alabama Attorney General. Welcome to Troy, and welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
So, you want to start here by just mentioning, that corporations have taken a number of stands on social issues, and that really sort of in stark contrast in the past when corporations have been known to take more of a lower profile to stay out of controversial issues. And I guess the reason for that is sort of simple. They're in the business of selling Coca-Cola or other products. And normally they don't want to offend their potential customers, but we've seen a change here, haven't we?
Yes, I do not know of a similar episode in corporate history. Corporations have been involved in political controversies, particularly, I'm thinking back to the companies like Honeywell in the late 60s and early 70s that had trouble recruiting on college campuses because they were involved in different defense contracts and supporting of the Vietnam War and all of that. So historically, it's always been the corporations have been sort of doing the disfavored thing, and we're under attack from people on the different point of the political spectrum. But not in this sort of proactive kind of way we see them here.
And it's also related to many corporations have been pursuing some environmental goals and other social policy goals besides this as well. Now, before we get into talking too much about what corporations should do, we should talk a little bit about what exactly is a corporation and its legal structure, so we make sure we understand who's running a corporation and who ultimately legally owns the corporation.
Right. Okay. Pretty simple answers as far as the law is concerned anyway about who owns it. The shareholders own what's called the residual claim to the corporation's income. So after the corporation pays all of its creditors and its taxes, then whatever's left belongs to the shareholders as a group. Now, there are only two things that can happen with the net income from a corporation. The board can decide to either pay out a share of it in dividends to the shareholders or to reinvest the net income in expanding the company. And that's like the critical decision the board makes, is the dividend policy about how much is to be given to the shareholders as income and how much will be retained and reinvested in some way. But that's a decision for the board.
Okay, so then you mentioned the board, and that would be a board of directors of the company, right?
Right. They're elected by the shareholders. Normally, in a corporation, the board will nominate candidates for any vacancy that occurs, so the board's kind of self-perpetuating in that way. And the shareholders vote for the board, but they typically don't know much about who the candidates are or what they stand for, any of the rest of it. It's kind of a pro forma thing, quite frankly, the idea of shareholder democracy and all of that. most shareholders, and when I say shareholder, unless I indicate otherwise, I mean individual shareholders. You know, you and me and people saving for their retirement and all of that, not more sophisticated, wealthier individuals or institutions such as insurance companies or pension funds or mutual funds. Those people all are going to have a good idea of who if there's a dispute about the board of a corporation, they'll know what the inside story is about all that. You and I will not. We will not know. And what's more, it's rational for us not to really care that much or exercise much of an effort to find out about the corporation's inner workings, because we can't affect them. Right. If I own 100 shares of Walmart, I'm not going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things when it comes to electing a board or anything else. And so I don't pay attention.
And that's because large corporations have like millions of shares.
Yeah.
And so it's in public choice economics, we study how elections work from a standpoint of using microeconomics to think about individual people's incentives. And we've identified that there's some weaknesses in voting as a way to try to make sure our governors or legislators effectively serve our interests. And so some of that carries over, I imagine, into
right. There's a phrase actually in the history of American corporation law that captures the essence of the corporation. Is it involves the separation of ownership and control. In a partnership, the partners also control the business. They manage the business, usually directly. I mean, you go into work every day and you have a very intimate knowledge of your own business with a handful of other partners. In a corporation, especially a large publicly traded one, if I own 100 shares of Walmart, I don't expect to ever have to help Walmart make a decision. I have no idea who the other shareholders are. We don't communicate. Right. And so I own it in the sense that I and all the other shareholders are entitled to what's left over after all the creditors are paid. But we do not control it, except through this very sort of minimal participation in electing the board. And that's subject to the public choice kind of concerns that you just mentioned.
And then we talk about usually, I mentioned that the CEO of Coca-Cola, that's a chief executive officer, and if I understand, the board of directors then actually hires or fires the CEO who's going to run the company on a day-to-day basis, right?
Right, yeah. And
given this whole process, in a sense, although we can say that the CEO is supposed to be working for the stockholders, economists like to use the term principal agent framework here. The stockholders are in charge. The CEO at some level is supposed to be doing what they want what the shareholders want the CEO to do. The CEO is going to have some discretion. He's going to have some ability to do stuff that may or may not be in the stockholders' best interest, right?
That's exactly right. And that gap between what your agent might want to do and what the principal would prefer them to do is kind of the thing that animated a big debate back during the Depression among particularly law professors who taught about this. It's like, what should we do about this agency gap in the corporation? And so you can look at the separation of ownership and control as a feature or a bug, essentially. And in the 30s, because people were kind of down on capitalism generally, there was a lot of attention paid to the idea that, well, it's a bug, it's bad that shareholders don't have more of a role in the corporation's operations. But later, people sort of took a second look at that and decided, that's really not any way to run a railroad, is to have some sort of big, town meeting sort of approach to making decisions. It's just not possible to do it that way. And so the legislation that Congress passed in the 1930s to regulate the securities markets and to set up the Securities and Exchange Commission was all based on that separation of ownership is bad view of things. Like, the government needs to come and fix this because shareholders are at the mercy, essentially, of these directors and officers.
Now, when we talk about the law for corporations, where is this law coming from the federal government or from the states?
No, it's from the states, and that's a unique thing about American corporation law. One professor, scholar in this area, calls it the genius of American corporation law is we do it at the state level. And that developed historically. I mean, Congress certainly could, if it wanted to, usurp this field and take it over and say, oh, it's interstate commerce, we get to regulate this. But so far they haven't. And if we have time, I'll come back. The House passed a bill last month that would take a big step in the direction of federalizing all this. But hopefully that won't pass the Senate, in my opinion, and we'll stay at the state level. Each state has its own corporation laws, and that means that states can compete with one another to attract corporations to incorporate under their laws and pay taxes to them. You don't actually have to be physically present in Delaware, say. You can have a business completely in Alabama in terms of the operations and be a Delaware corporation if you just file the papers there and pay their taxes and fees. And a lot of businesses find it advantageous once they get to a certain size to reincorporate, usually in Delaware. So it's state law, and it's subject to competition between the states to try to make their laws more attractive to business people as they're setting up and trying to finance a business.
So I mentioned that economists and others have been debating about the role of corporations and the discretion of CEOs possibly for some time. 2020 marked the 50th anniversary of a very famous article by the economist Milton Friedman on exactly this topic, and it generated lots of interest and impact ultimately on policy, I think, and thinking. And it was entitled the social responsibility of corporations is increase their profit. A very controversial and thought-provoking idea. But what was Professor Friedman trying to say there?
He was responding to the then current calls for increased social responsibility on the part of corporations. So this seems to happen recurrently in American history. We'll have these kind of debates like we seem to be having now. And his was a response to, it was an early call for increased environmental remediation by corporations and other kinds of socially desirable, up to a point, kinds of things that corporations could do. And Friedman's argument basically was, look, the sort of corporations have one job, and it's essentially the resource allocation function, which is about the most important function there is. Somebody has got to make the decision about how we use scarce resources in terms of building new factories or starting new lines of business. And businesses do that in our system for the most part. And we think that people with a profit motive in mind make better decisions than public sector folks would if they were given the same responsibility. So this is as crucial a decision as we have to make, is do you really want, through this corporate social responsibility thing, for corporations to act more like government agencies, or would it be a good idea for them to act like businesses and to continue to try to maximize their own profit, which they can only do if they respond to consumer wants and needs and demands effectively. That's the way you do that. And so, that's ultimately what we want is corporations to be effective managers and effective resource allocators and use the resources we have to best satisfy the public's needs and wants.
And within a market economy, since all consumer purchases are voluntary, at some level, when a company makes a profit, they are providing something of value to people, and that's why they're able to sell their product or service, because consumers value it and are willing to pay for it, and that makes our lives better off. So when we talk about profit, you might think it's like you're just going to enrich capitalists, but it really is you're already, in effect, in one sense, serving the social good.
Absolutely.
By pursuing profit.
Yeah, you and I have the great good fortune to be born in America, and we sort of take a free ride on that every day. I'm not responsible for more than just my tiny sliver of the bounty of American life, and yet here I am. And so, yeah, it's something that people don't think about a lot, but maybe they should stop and consider that every now and then.
And also, to be clear, Professor Friedman, his article was it was explicitly saying that businesses have to follow the law and they need to follow the ethics. So when he was saying pursuit of profit, he wasn't saying like sacrifice others or cheat others to order
right.
to pursue your profit,
Yeah,
but to do
absolutely.
so, pursue profit ethically, and that would be a good thing for stockholders. And I guess economists and finance faculty professors have analyzed this, but they usually mention that although stockholders, like everybody else, care about a lot more than money. When it comes down to it, one thing that you've got millions of stockholders, one thing that they might all agree on is that the company can make money, and that would allow them to pursue their other goals as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. When the dividend check comes, if you want to take part of it and give it to the United Way or your church or whatever you choose to give it to, as opposed to having the board make your charitable contribution decisions for you, that's sort of an individual empowerment thing rather than having a collective decision made about charity.
And if the company makes more profits, then the stockholders ultimately would have more money to not only spend on themselves, but also give to their favorite charities or improve their communities. Now then, in 2019, a group known as the Business Roundtable came out with a new statement of purpose for corporations, in which they called for corporations to pursue stakeholder interests in contrast to stockholder interests. So first off, tell us a little bit, like, what's this because those words sound pretty similar, but they have different meanings.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between a stakeholder versus a stockholder?
Yeah, it's interesting that they are so close. It's almost like it's a rhetorical strategy to confuse people or to minimize the difference. And those are two very different foci for the corporation to have. The thing about stockholder welfare is, as hard as it is to maximize profit, at least we can all agree on a scorecard for that. And accounting systems help us figure out the answer to the question of are we performing as well as we can, and all that. I honestly have no idea how a business leader would try to maximize the well-being of stockholders, employees, customers, people that live in cities where you have operations. There are just too many groups. And there are, first of all, there are contracts with all the non-shareholder groups already that address the nature of that relationship. And secondarily, everything being equal, it would be nice if you could give all your employees a raise. I'm sure they'd appreciate it and they would prefer that, right? That takes money away from shareholders if you do that. If you pay more than the market rate for labor, unless you have some plan about why that will get you the best workers, and you'll, through that strategy, maximize your profits. That was Henry Ford's idea, actually. He paid twice the going rate in Detroit for labor, and he had his pick of the best craftsmen available in that market at the time. So, but he, probably what he was trying to do was increase the bottom line, although he'd never admit that. So the stakeholder business is an attempt to turn business decision making into something that looks more like politics, and it's just poisonous. It's just a really bad idea to say we're going to make everybody as happy as we possibly can. And it's like, well, there are these direct conflicts of interest involved in that, and I don't know how you trade them off. There's no system for accounting for that's anywhere near the accuracy of the accounting systems that are used for profit maximization.
And as we mentioned already, one of the groups of stakeholders that sometimes laid out are customers. But in a market economy, businesses already have to compete for customers' business, and so at some level, no business can stay in business if they're not delivering something of value to customers, so they won't buy their product. So, as an economist looking at that, it's certainly the part of the customers as a stakeholder that has to be represented. Well, if the business isn't doing that already, they're going to be out of business, and the CEO is probably going to lose their job, and so there's already going to be some taken. And you mentioned employees as another group that are stakeholders. They are already dealing with them in terms of contracts. They have to pay them a wage that makes them willing to work and so forth. So as you said, that there are provisions in place for taking care of some of these other stakeholders, that we don't need to do it more directly. And you mentioned a little bit about, like, maybe want to expand on this some. As you bring more and more people in to try to make a decision, it becomes very difficult to make a decision, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the corporate form arose from the need to get more investors together for bigger and bigger capital projects, and as America grew. And the big sort of breakthrough moment came when railroad construction reached a certain point, and those businesses, American railroads, were the largest corporations in the history of the world at the time that they were created and financed. And so you had to have a very large number of investors, each putting in a relatively small amount compared to the whole. Might have been significant for each individual, but I'm going to take some of my savings and invest it in this railroad. And I have no training in running a railroad. I have no expertise to offer. I live in Alabama. This railroad is, if it's New York Central, it's very far away. And I'm not going to go attend a meeting of the investors. If we tried to all be partners, you'd have to have partnership meetings, or try to, and have people travel long distances, and people aren't going to do that. So it's a question of the scale of the enterprise that you're financing. And if you need a lot of investors, relatively small investors, to participate, you can't use the partnership form because you couldn't find a building big enough to rent, or you'd have to have it in a stadium or something to have a partnership meeting. So it's that kind of very practical limitation on the partnership form.
And some of markets can also, if there are investors who feel that maybe the environmental laws aren't as strict as they need to be. The company could still be following the law, but if the law isn't strict enough, they could be harming the environment, or at least in one way that they see that they're harming the environment. If an investor wants to be environmentally conscious, they can choose not to invest in a company that might not be doing as much as they want to. And at one level, there's no problem with people expressing their opinions, or this is similarly with consumers. I remember back some years ago now, they were concerned about how tuna were being caught, and if they were using the wrong kind of nets, and so you could pay extra to get tuna that would be harvested without the nets that would hurt the dolphins. And so if you want to go beyond what the law requires, either as customers or workers or investors, you are free to express your preferences that way by choosing who you're going to do business with, who you're going to work for, who you're going to buy, what products you're going to buy.
Right.
And so there is already a way to incorporate a lot of social and environmental concerns into markets.
In your own investing strategy and everything. There are mutual funds that are set up for ethical investors. If you want to put your money in an ethically guided fund and all that sort of thing, that's available. In the last, 10 years or so, I think it's up to about 2/3 of the states now have a statute that allows for what's called a public benefit corporation, which is it's a corporation that announces, hey, we're going to be sort of maximally socially responsive here. And they forsake profit maximization as their single goal. So if you want to invest in companies that act that way, look for public benefit corporations. They're out there. So I don't know if I'm not advising anybody to do that. I personally don't think that would be a great investment strategy, but everybody makes their own decision here.
Part of what so some of this is environmental or socially or responsible activities are already being incorporated in some ways. But you hinted at that some people want to sort of make this mandatory for businesses, and might be able to do it through the SEC, or you mentioned a bill that was introduced in Congress. So tell us a little bit about this push. If these are good things, why don't we make corporations do them? Right.
So the SEC has rulemaking authority. So it's used it many times in its history. It's now almost 90 years old. So it's been considering a rule about disclosures, mandatory disclosures, which is the way the SEC mostly operates, about environmental issues with the corporation's operations, and in particular global warming or climate change kind of concerns. Now, so far we're at a stage where they're talking about disclosure all right? And so it sounds like the other things the SEC requires. But it's different to the extent that up until fairly recently, the SEC took as its job was investor protection. I mean, that's sort of like the whole focus of it is we want to like force corporations to disclose enough information so that really individual investors can have a chance at evaluating the worthiness of a corporation stock as an investment possibility. This doesn't sound like that. It sounds more like we want to force corporations, and in particular corporations in the oil and gas and coal industries, to come forward with a lot of information, and we'll tell you specify what that will be later about that and its effect on the environment. And I assume this is all kind of preparatory to a push later in some regulatory vein about, now the corporation shouldn't do this and they should do that. At this stage, it's just disclosure, and so it's harder to kind of sound an alarm bell about, I suppose. But it's a really significantly different approach to rulemaking than the agency has had for most of its history. And so that's troubling.
Especially as you mentioned, like going beyond investor protection to pursue other issues here. Some people who say that we should mandate more behavior like this from corporations would say that corporations are sort of given this like privilege to operate by the government, and by that they're referring to this these laws that you mentioned under which corporations incorporate. And in exchange for being allowed to operate in this way, should corporations face additional burdens or demands?
Okay, so that's a really good point to bring up. The simple answer is that corporation law, as long as we leave it with the states, is going to be an enabling statute rather than a regulatory statute. So this is there for investors to use to create businesses. It doesn't really require anything much beyond, and the requirements are procedural for the most part, so they're not substantive. There's not like reduce your pollution or increase your wages or whatever people might have in mind here for additional regulations of business. It's not a concession really, except to the extent that investors have limited personal liability for tort claims, and that's not all that significant concession. So if you want to try to make corporation law regulatory, that'd be the last field of law that's that's just trying to be helpful and not regulatory. So. And we do have a number of other regulatory statutes. It's not like you need to take this one and make it demanding on businesses, it seems to me.
I mean, I guess another way that I would look at it, I'm not a lawyer, but I look at it as like, if people have a right to start a business, then it's not a privilege that the government's giving them. I think people should have a right to start their own business, especially if they're just following the general laws and they're not trying to break other laws.
Sure.
So we just have a few moments left. So anything you want to say in terms of wrapping up, or like what we should be thinking about going forward here?
Well, keep an eye on the SEC. If you go to their website and just Google the letters ESG for environmental, social, and governance reforms, they've collected all of their current material on this one website. It's very, very handy. And there's a writer at the Competitive Enterprise Institute named Richard Morrison who follows this very closely and writes about it a lot. And so that's CEI.org, and he's a good source for this.
Well, thanks very much for coming on to talk about these important issues with us, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.